Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're doing great. In today's musing, I want to mention, many of you may not know this, that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a manual that they have put out for religious freedom. From what I can tell, this isn't a printed manual. It's mostly an online compilation of articles and things that they call a manual. Nonetheless, here it is. You can see, for those of you watching the video, this collection of articles, this manual on religious freedom. I want to unpack a little bit of this and make the case that the focus that the institution of the church often takes on religious freedom, while important and good and necessary, is also myopic in the sense that it excludes a more, I believe, fundamental fight for freedom that encompasses religious freedom, and that we're doing ourselves a potential disservice if we narrowly focus on religious freedom to the exclusion or the disinterest, the disengagement of the broader elements, more fundamental aspects of freedom as well. Let's get into the manual a little bit. In the introductory article, it reads in part, "Religious freedom is more than just the freedom to believe what you want. It's also the freedom to talk about and act on your core beliefs without interference from government or others except when necessary to protect health and safety." This is a point that is reiterated in the conclusion of the manual, where it also reads that religious freedom is the right to exercise or live your religion without interference from government or others except when necessary to protect health and safety. Now, I'm going to save for a moment this aspect of public health and safety as exceptions to this. We'll get into that and address that point in just a moment. First, I want to focus more on the idea that religious freedom, as defined by the church, and I agree with this definition, is not just about beliefs, it's also about behavior. But the government has not always been keen on protecting that and encompassing religious freedom so as to include behavior as some sort of standard. What do I mean by that? Well, let's use the federal government's fight against the early Latter-day Saints and the polygamous Brighamites out in Utah as an example. So in 1862, the U.S. Congress passed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act. This outlawed polygamy in U.S. territories, of which Utah was one, and it was aimed to target the Mormon practice of polygamy out in Utah. George Reynolds was an individual who was indicted for bigamy under this law after he married a second wife while still legally being married to his first. His case was kind of a provocative test case to challenge the Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862. And some 17 years later, the Supreme Court took up the case and ruled on it, unanimously agreeing with the following opinion that states in part, "Laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinions, they may with practices. Suppose one believed that human sacrifices were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that the civil government under which he lived could not interfere to prevent a sacrifice? So here," they continued, "as a law of the organization of society under the exclusive dominion of the United States, it is provided that plural marriages shall not be allowed. Can a man excuse his practices to the contrary because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land." So the black-robed lawyers on the Supreme Court unanimously arguing in 1879 that laws exist to govern actions. They don't interfere with beliefs and opinions, but they may and do with practices, with people's behavior. Of course, they're raising the point of child sacrifices. I might respond to this and say, it's very clear that in the case of a child sacrifice, there is a victim whose rights are being inherently and clearly violated, which therefore justifies the intervention of the state to protect the victim and to proscribe the behavior. This is a clear malum in se type of regulation. Bad in and of itself. That's what the Latin means. These are laws, malum in se laws, are such that, hey, murder, theft, assault, things where there's a clear victim and it's clearly violative of the other person's rights. These are inherently bad actions. Therefore, laws to prohibit them and then hold people accountable when they violate them are reasonable, as in a civil society under the state. Malum prohibitum acts, by contrast, are those that are bad only because they've been decreed as such by a Congress or a state legislature or a city council. These are things where there's not necessarily a victim, at least not a clear one. There might be a victim in the aggregate or a victim that you're inferring, but there's not a clear, like if there's child sacrifice, it's very clear who the victim is, right? But malum in se, this is like jaywalking is a, simple example, right? It's not inherently bad. It's not bad in and of itself. It's just illegal because some group of politicians got together and decreed it as such. So in response to the Supreme Court, I might say your example of child sacrifice is a clear malum in se. So obviously a religious group that says child sacrifice is okay can still be regulated, punished for that behavior because there is a clear victim. By contrast, polygamy, even though I don't think polygamy is of God and all the things we've talked about in the past, there's not necessarily a victim. If consenting adults are entering into this relationship, you can infer that the women are victimized. You can sympathize with the sob stories of many of the women engaging in the practice. You can believe that there is religious pressure, this implication of exaltation and God's favor predicated on entering into the practice. But there's pressure to engage in any number of actions, religious or otherwise. Simply saying that doesn't mean that there's a victim. It just means that someone is induced into action based on certain trade-offs that they've chosen as a rational actor and a consenting adult to make. So that would be kind of my retort to the court, that their desire to say we can regulate any religious behavior because clearly child sacrifice would be wrong. Therefore, anything, religions might do that we just want to go ahead and decree as unlawful, we can go ahead and regulate. When polygamy, it's not clear at all that that is a malum in se. Therefore, the prohibition of it by law is problematic. Now, this ruling, this 1879 ruling, the case is called Reynolds versus United States. And its contention about Caesar's supremacy have become the legal basis for a number of resulting actions, such as punishing a person for using peyote in a religious ceremony, forcing a baker to create a celebratory cake in support of a marital practice, a homosexual marital practice that he religiously opposes, coercing Catholics into providing birth control to their employees despite its conflict with their theological views. So this argument, this legal basis from this 1879 court has given rise to any number of actions in which religious actions or actions arising from one's religious views are dismissed, are set aside, are undermined, because the court will say, well, you can believe what you want, but when it comes to your behavior, when it comes to your actions, we can regulate that as we wish. So much for religious freedom. And yet, today's Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not the one from 1879 in a way, but today's church actually agrees with the Supreme Court that the government can regulate the practice of religion, at least in one context, and that is from the church's Religious Freedom Manual, the portions that I read at the beginning from both the introduction and the conclusion, talking about how, and again, I quote, that, religious freedom, you should be able to do all these things except when necessary to protect health and safety. That term verbatim appears in the introduction and in the conclusion of the Religious Freedom Manual. Again, the right to exercise or live your religion without interference from government or others, not period, but comma, except when necessary to protect health and safety. This exception is so broad you could drive a truck through it, as the saying goes. As just one example, from my time working in politics, let's take occupational licensure as an example. These are the laws where you need a government permission slip in order to be able to legally work in your chosen profession. And that could be, on the one end, being a doctor. It could also be, in some states, being a bus driver or a florist or a landscape designer or doing nails for someone, and all these things, right? Where the government has said, we will punish you by law unless you get this permission slip and jump through these hoops to satisfy the government. So we've, in our organization, fought occupational licensure laws over the years. And consistently, what the advocates of occupational licensure do is either introduce into law or defend what's already in the law, this portion where it says that the government has the right to regulate these professions to protect public health and safety. Sometimes they'll throw in welfare as well. That one in particular we've attacked because it's just extra broad. Public safety is broad, public health is broad, but public welfare, like, what does that mean? So we've tried to just say, hey, focus just on public health and safety, which is where, in theory, government has a compelling interest to intervene. If there is clearly a threat to public health, if there is clearly a threat to public safety, then that is the rational in theory, the theoretical basis for the state's justification is to protect people's rights, to protect their safety and their health, etc. But their welfare, like, what does that mean? And like, to what lengths can the government go? Like, so we've in particular tried to fight the public welfare thing, but public health and safety, still very broad and often broadly construed, just like the general welfare clause of the Constitution. It's like, hey, we're going to delegate all these powers from the states to the federal government, and we're going to enumerate them specifically, but we're also going to say that they are to promote the general welfare. Therefore, you can latch on to just that little snippet of statement and say, oh, the federal government can do whatever it wants to promote the general welfare as long as it will help people or do good things. Like, people just read into these terms all kinds of things. And I believe the same is true of public health and public safety. Let's not forget, of course, that in addition to being counseled to be good global citizens as church members, the newsroom of the church put this out April 2020, right as COVID was on a tear and everyone's freaking out. This comes from, approved at the highest levels of the church. This stuff doesn't get out in the newsroom without the blessing of the First Presidency, but it was not published under their name. It was published under the newsroom. This is a strategy that's often done to give a little bit of separation. In years past, it would be a Deseret News unsigned editorial, things like that. The statement says, we acknowledge that in exceptional circumstances, all, and I point out, all individual rights may be reasonably restricted for a time to protect the safety of the general public. That is from our church, April 2020, amid a time when the government was doing just that, not just pertaining to religious freedom, but as the statement itself acknowledges, all individual rights. They're agreeing with the Supreme Court again. Right? Oh, here's these exceptions. If it's for public health, if it's for public safety, all rights, including religious freedom, both belief and behavior, can be reasonably restricted. What does that mean? And who gets to decide, more importantly? Because inevitably, it is the chief violators of your rights that are also the arbiters of appropriateness. We are allowing the executioner to also be the judge. We're saying that the government, who is encroaching upon these rights in the name of public health and safety, gets to determine what is a reasonable restriction. How does that make any sense? This logic, by the way, to say that all rights may be reasonably restricted if it can keep people safe for public health or for public safety, would justify, my heavens, all kinds of things. Think of the Japanese internment during World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens, by the way, rounded up, incarcerated. The government claimed that it was necessary to prevent espionage and sabotage, public safety. This atrocity is completely consistent with the counsel in the Religious Freedom Manual and that statement from the church newsroom in April of 2020. These are exceptions being made for public safety. Who can argue against them? It would also, this logic, justify the dropping of the atomic bombs. which J. Reuben Clark rightly called a fiendish butchery. Nonetheless, hey, this is public safety. We're worried that the Japanese are going to attack us, so let's preemptively attack them because public safety. So, think of I mentioned this a few months ago, I feel like, in the musing on the church's position on vaccines over the years, the issue of the swine flu. 1976, everyone's freaking out. They rush the production of this vaccine. They mandate the vaccine and tried to save. There had only been, my recollection is, I think one person died as a result of the swine flu, and yet the mandatory vaccination program resulted in at least 450 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a rare neurological disorder. There were also about 25 deaths linked to the vaccine, not to the underlying disease for which the vaccine was being rushed into production and distribution. But again, public health, right? But your bodily autonomy is a individual right. All individual rights may be reasonably restricted for a time to protect the safety of the general public. When you're giving these broad exceptions and empowering the executioner to be the judge, it leads to things like this. Think of the Sedition Act. There's actually two of them that are egregious. There's the one from Adams' administration early on, where they were worried about the French, and so they criminalize the attacking they criminalize the criticism of the president or the Congress, because there were a lot of people who were really upset with the Federalists, and then the Alien Acts. You've heard the Alien and Sedition Acts, probably. The Alien Acts were restricting French immigration. The Federalists were worried that all these French spilling into America because of the French Revolution happening. We're going to side with Jefferson and his party against Adams and the Federalist Party. So anyways, all this commotion is going on. A lot of people are attacking, like, this is ridiculous. So they passed the Sedition Act. Thou shalt not speak ill of the president or Congress, which is completely unconstitutional based on the First Amendment, of course. Nonetheless, they passed it. A fun little interesting tidbit, if you're not clued in on this, is that I said they criminalized the criticism of the president and the Congress. I left out the vice president because at the time, the top two vote getters became president and vice president, which meant that the vice president was typically the member of a different competing political party. In this case, it was Jefferson. He was the vice president to his rival and secretly engaged in efforts to undermine what Adams was doing with the Alien and Sedition Acts, in particular working with James Madison to get the Kentucky and Virginia state legislatures to push back and to nullify what the federal government was doing. Nonetheless, people were criminalized under the Sedition Act. Many people. One fun story is Benjamin Franklin's grandson. He was the editor of a newspaper, and he was attacking, criticizing John Adams. And for that, he was fined and I believe also sentenced to some jail time. A number of other newspaper editors were as well that were critical of the Federalists. There was the Sedition Act a century later during World War I. Prohibited speech that was deemed to be disloyal or abusive towards the government or the war effort. World War I, of course. Over 2,000 individuals were prosecuted for their speech, often for criticizing conscription of the war. So here are these people objecting to a mandatory draft, forcing people, again, bodily autonomy, people saying, I'm not a pawn in your stupid war that we shouldn't be in, and they're being prosecuted for it. Public safety, right? All individual rights may be reasonably restricted for a time. Okay, well, that would justify the Sedition Act and keep the church silent because, well, we've said that if it's about safety, then, all rights may be reasonably restricted. I think of prohibition, which Heber J. Grant, who was a major advocate of prohibition, I talk about this in Latter-day Liberty, my first book. He was an ardent prohibitionist. He called, for example, prohibition the greatest financial and moral blessing that has ever come to humanity. No, right? Not at all. Prohibition, of course, created a massive black market. It gave rise to Al Capone. People started getting liquor, converting liquor on the black market. I share this story in the Tuttle Twins Guide to True Conspiracies, where the government knew that bootleggers were taking industrial alcohol and changing the chemical composition with some additives to turn it into drinking alcohol. And this being Prohibition era, the government, when they clued into this fact, didn't stop it, didn't arrest them, didn't whatever. they instead changed the chemical composition of the industrial alcohol to add in some like soaps and other chemicals without the bootleggers knowing. And so they still stole the industrial alcohol with the changed composition. They did their chemical treatment of it. A bunch of people drank it. It was like 10,000 people died as a result of the government manipulating the formula to try and like get at these bootleggers and try and root out those who were illegally imbibing, right? But like, give me a break. That's ridiculous. Prohibition was awful. And yet, public health, public safety would have justified it. Same thing with the war on drugs today, incarcerating all these people, fueling the rise of the cartels. All of this nonsense would all be excused and justified on the basis of a reasonable restriction due to public health and safety. Of course, we can go into the New Deal or the TSA, the NSA. I mean, like the list is long. And I'll ask you, the viewer, which of Caesar's aggressive expansions of power, and by Caesar, of course, I mean just government in general, the state in general, which of these aggressive expansions of power and the exercise of power were not using public safety or public health as a pretext, right? Like, tyrants typically don't succeed by just becoming tyrannical from day one. There's always the excuse. There's the false flag. There's the pretext. It's for your safety, right? We're keeping you safe. And that is how all this tyranny is justified. And yet the church's manual and the church's newsroom is saying, well, yeah, we agree with that. Go ahead and reasonably restrict all rights. Now, they would probably quibble with a lot of these things and say, well, that was unreasonable. But again, we're empowering the executioner to be the judge. And so therefore, if we just say, yeah, we agree with the general point that the tyrants always use, by the way, to restrict people's rights, but we agree with the general point, so now we have to be silent because we've agreed with the point that these tyrants, so-called, are actively using to violate people's rights. But what can we say about it? Because we've already conceded that, if it's about public health or safety, then those are exceptions. I think 1 Thessalonians says it best. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. Peace and safety, right? Since time immemorial, it's always the pretext in which tyranny comes. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the Religious Freedom Manual that I'm not going to get into. I'm just more making you aware of it and picking out a couple things that I think are relevant and worth my musing on. One of them also comes from the introduction. It says, despite its importance, religious freedom is increasingly under assault around the world. That's why the apostles have spoken about this topic dozens of times in the last decade. As prophets, seers, and revelators, they recognize the need to defend religious freedom. Each of us has a role to play. To which I would ask, where are the warnings? Because it says, the apostles have spoken about this topic dozens of times in the last decade. I would ask, where are the warnings about the underlying issues? I think, sure, you can say religious freedom is under assault around the world, but freedom more broadly, I think, is under way more assault. And so it kind of looks weird to me if we are only speaking out as an institution, as a church congregation, as a faith community, if we're only speaking out in defense of a subset of freedom. Like here's all we care about. Here's what immediately impacts us. So we're not even going to really talk about, care about, preach about all this other stuff. We're just going to talk dozens of times in the last decade about this little subset of freedom, which is important. I'm not discounting that religious freedom itself is important. I'm simply questioning the prudence, the appropriateness of almost exclusively focusing on that subset. I think of the quote from Joseph F. Smith, the kingdom of God is a kingdom of freedom. The gospel of the Son of God is the gospel of liberty. Or Captain Moroni, right? When he said this title of liberty, in memory of our God, our religion and freedom and our peace, our wives and our children. He didn't put on the banner when he rent his garment, in memory of our religious freedom. It was freedom more broadly. That was the title of liberty, the standard to which he was rallying God's people, freedom in general. This quote from Marion G. Romney, many others I could share, but we'll conclude this part with this one. The sweets of liberty about which we usually speak may be classified as 1. Political independence, 2. Economic freedom, and 3. Free agency. I would have us strive for that liberty which comprehends all 3 of these freedoms and more. I would have us strive for a freedom of the soul to which they all contribute. I would have us attain that blessed state foreshadowed by the prophet Joseph Smith when he said, "Let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly, then shall thy confidence wax strong in the presence of God." One who enjoys such liberty is, in the words of Jesus, free indeed. So here, Marion G. Romney is quoting Joseph Smith in part in Doctrine and Covenants, that's section 121. There's another quote from Joseph Smith that is often used in connection with religious freedom. This comes from 1843, when Joseph said, "I am bold to declare before heaven that I am just as ready to die for a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or any other denomination." Now, this quote is often shared to illustrate the prophet Joseph Smith's generosity of spirit and his defense of religious tolerance. But what often goes unquoted is what Joseph said immediately after. He said, continuing, "It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty." So these quotes I've shared, Marion Romney and Captain Moroni and Joseph F. Smith, and certainly here Joseph F. Smith, encompass a much broader freedom, not just the subset thereof that immediately pertains to religious matters. What inspires Joseph's soul? It was a love of liberty, civil and religious liberty. Of course, he was at the whatever. He was subject frequently to injustices in civil matters, frequently sued and brought before judges and incarcerated and all this stuff. So it was very clear and present to him, this danger of big government and this erosion of liberty, not just in a specifically religious context, but a broader civil context as well. I think it's important to note here that religious freedom, why do I say it's a subset of freedom? I believe religious freedom is really just an outgrowth of 3 things. Number 1, property rights. Number 2, the freedom of speech. And number 3, the freedom of association. So property rights, the first one, right? You need to be able to have religious freedom, own or be able to rent or lease property for your church, for your temple, or your home in which you can worship, or any property where people can gather, where you are the master of your domain, right? You're the king of the castle. That is your property to do on it what you please, as long as you're not harming other people. So if you have property rights, that is the fundamental unit, not only of freedom more broadly, but certainly religious freedom as well. The second, of course, is freedom of speech, the ability not just to think what you want, but be able to speak it, share it, do missionary work, publish tracts, literature, scriptures, right? To be able to disseminate information. That is a freedom of speech. That is an extension of religious freedom, but it's also an extension of just freedom in general, of course. And then the third is freedom of association, being able to gather with like-minded believers, to congregate and worship together, to exclude certain people, right? The freedom of association also encompassing the freedom of disassociation and being able to excommunicate or exclude people. And so religious freedom is an outgrowth of these things. If you have property rights and the freedom of speech and association, you have religious freedom, right? But if we focus just on religious freedom, we can tolerate, while myopically focusing just on that subset, we can tolerate the erosion of property rights and the freedom of speech and the freedom of association, while still saying, okay, we have our religious freedom, but all around us, the walls are crumbling. The manual, by the way, gets a little bit close here in an article talking about what happens when religious freedom supposedly conflicts with other rights. And in that article, they say, protecting enough space for everyone to live according to what matters most to them, whether religious or not, is the best way to proceed when rights seem to conflict. So let's have a space where everyone kind of live and let live, right? Everyone can live according to what matters most to them, even if it's religious or not. That's the best way, this very kind of libertarianish approach, live and let live, to proceed when rights seem to conflict. I think it might have been a little bit better to say protecting the fundamental rights of each individual, whether exercised for religious purposes or not, is the best way to proceed and will avoid conflicts with any other rights. If each person is protected in these fundamental rights, you don't have conflict. In fact, there is no conflict. And I will note, I appreciate that the church's manual said this is the best way to proceed when rights seem to conflict, at least a concession that maybe there is no actual conflict, there's just a perception thereof. And why do I say that? Well, rights don't conflict. Negative rights and positive rights do, right? A negative right being the right to be left alone, to not be murdered, to not be assaulted. Rights have corresponding duties. So if I have a right, a negative right to not be murdered, then you have a duty not to murder me. It's not a duty to actively do something for me. It's a duty to not do something. That's why it's negative. You have a duty to not assault me. You have a duty to not steal from me because I have those negative rights. Positive rights are like in the USSR Constitution, where it's like you have the right to be taken care of and all these things to your old age and leisure and, recreation and all the stuff, right? Or what Congress does all the time, the housing rights, healthcare rights, all these things. These are positive rights because they don't exist in nature. They're not natural. And they require again, rights have duties. So positive rights have positive duties. If someone has the positive right to housing or healthcare or employment or education, then someone else, namely taxpayers, has to shoulder the positive duty of actively doing something, which is typically surrendering taxes and or tolerating the debasement of our savings so that they can inflate the money supply and then shower those favored parties with new money. Point is that when we have a conflict of rights, it's typically, perhaps always, I haven't thought this through super deeply to analyze whether I can use the superlative and say this is always the case, but it's at least typically the case that these conflicts of rights are between negative rights and positive rights, right? Congress or some state legislature has bestowed some positive right on someone. Let's use an example that, the church is often involving itself in, and that is, employers being able to set moral standards for their employees, like a church wanting to be able to exclude people who are in a gay marriage, for example, or, pick your issue. Well, if that employee has been given the positive right of legal protections in their job against an employer's actions, that's a positive right. It doesn't naturally exist. What naturally exists is freedom of association, and the employer can choose to disassociate with the employee. We call this at-will employment, right? It's just provided that both parties continue to agree, then the employment relationship exists. But the government often steps in, creates positive rights to protect the employer. And what they're doing is they are now violating the natural rights, the negative rights of the employer, the free association rights. So those rights get violated in order to create these positive rights of protection. And so that's where the rights conflict. Now, most religious freedom efforts have focused on the institution, not the individual. To use the case we just did, the Grand Compromise, as it was called in Utah, or as the church calls it elsewhere, where they're working on this in other states and the federal government, the Fairness for All Act. And this is a compromise between these perceptibly competing rights, the right of the church to have its freedom of association and the positive right of gay people to have protections in housing and employment. And so what came out of this compromise was narrow protections for the institution of the church so that they could continue to exclude certain people from employment, exclude them from church-owned properties, including housing. And so they carved out, I think myopically, I spoke out about this a decade ago when the church was pushing it here in Utah, and since, they myopically carved out protections for the legal institution of the church to the exclusion of everybody else. It was, hey, we as a church want to retain these rights to hire and fire who we want, which is freedom of association, to employ or to allow people onto our property who we want, to provide housing, etc., right? Property rights. Rather than defending those principles more broadly, the church myopically focused just on the religious application thereof and told everyone else in substance, in essence, to go pound sand. We're not here to help you. We're here to look out for these narrow institutional interests. But what about people acting on their religion in ways that the church may not like? These are people who themselves, not as institutions, but as individuals, are living an expression of their faith, perhaps. I think of, even in non-religious context, right? Think of D&C 123. We're told to waste and wear out our lives, bringing to light hidden things of darkness. So then I think of groups like WikiLeaks, which historically under Julian Assange, they were publishing war crimes and all these horrendous acts of the U.S. government. That is part of my religion, wasting and wearing out your life, bringing to light these hidden things of darkness, these sacred combinations, the military-industrial complex, all this stuff. WikiLeaks historically was doing that, for which Julian Assange was persecuted and incarcerated and only recently released and pardoned. But that's part of my religion. Yet the church doesn't support that. They're not going to publicly praise WikiLeaks. They're not going to side with people who are bringing to light hidden things of darkness against powerful institutions. That's interesting. I think of, going back to the Japanese internment or the Sedition Act during World War I, I think of people who are fighting conscription or renouncing war, anti-war activism, conscientious objectors, right? Soldiers who signed up under different circumstances and now being deployed to a war they think is immoral and unjust. And the church basically does not support conscientious objectors, right? Because they'll point to statements from church leaders and others being like, well, we support our government, therefore, we'll fight when told. And you don't really get the support of the institutional church to renounce war, whether you're a soldier or not. It's part of my religion, but I don't think the church supports that necessarily. I think of civil disobedience, of unjust laws. These could be drug laws, gun control, compulsory schooling, offering your services to support a gay wedding, right? If you morally disagree with that. If these laws are compelling behavior that violates your conscience, your moral code, your religious faith, I think that's part of my religion. The church doesn't support that, right? So we have this conflict between religious freedom narrowly and broader freedom, property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, more generally. And, a couple concluding thoughts. I'll start with a segue from what we were just discussing. I think despots thrive when groups defend only their interests narrowly, leaving aside a unified front that otherwise might exist against overreach, having a coalition of people with diverse interests and backgrounds and people who are supporting the broader principle as opposed to their narrow interests. We lose that when we myopically defend our own individual interests and not the broader principle. I think here of the famous poem from Pastor Niemöller during World War II, German theologians standing up against the Nazis and their extermination of the Christian church and all the things. And his poem, you've probably heard this before, says, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." That's not really a poem, right? That's I don't know what that would be called. I'm not good with that literary kind of stuff. Nonetheless, it's a powerful point. Here, each of these groups, he was trained to look out narrowly for his interests. He didn't speak out for the communists. He didn't speak out for the socialists, the trade unionists, the Jews, for other groups that were starting to be perhaps unfairly or unjustly targeted. Communists aren't great, but just because someone has these radical views doesn't mean that they should be oppressed and incarcerated or killed, etc. So his point is valid. It's very valid. He's like, each of these groups were just looking out for their own interests. I wasn't looking out for them or our shared broader interests, these underlying principles. And so because I took this myopic strategy, all of a sudden there was no one left to speak out for me because no one was speaking out about the broader issue. Everyone was just focused on their own thing. So I think that proactively championing the broader principles, all liberties, can forge unexpected alliances, right? Could turn the church into a moral leader in a coalition against tyranny rather than a lone voice looking out for its own rights. Getting back to Joseph, what inspired his soul? Liberty, civil and religious liberty more broadly, willing to die for people of other religion, not just for their religious beliefs, but for their liberty more generally. And, here I think of how tyranny doesn't always announce itself with overt religious persecution, right? It often starts with subtler erosions like surveillance or economic control or other things that start to then encroach upon and encircle faith. These despotic regimes don't necessarily or always immediately target religion. They target the broader principles, the broader freedoms, which inevitably, since religious freedom is an outgrowth of these three fundamental freedoms, if they're attacking these, then the outgrowth, the fruit, withers, rots, whatever. I think a bolder stance against these precursors, these broader attacks, could align with Captain Moroni's zeal, right? This is about freedom generally. I think true faithfulness then is, it includes the anticipation of threats, not just reacting to them. I think here of, this is actually in the context of religious freedom, this famous, semi-famous quote from James Madison. The context of religious freedom is one in which the legislature was considering the public funding using taxpayer dollars to support the Protestant church. And so it was kind of a state-funded church. That was the question at issue in this bill. When he said this quote, maybe you've heard of it, "It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the late revolution. The freemen of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. We revere this lesson too much soon to forget it." Powerful, powerful quote. I love this quote. Taking alarm, not when there's so much precedent, and, oh, but look at the good things I've done with these increased government powers, and, oh, Bob is a government employee. Why would you let Bob go? He's nice and he has a family. Like, the more that the government creeps, you have all these entanglements, he called them, these precedents, that it becomes harder to react to. Again, as I just said with the Captain Moroni thing, we need to start anticipating threats, not just reacting to them. And so here's Madison saying, this is what the freemen of America did. They objected to the violation of the principles. They saw the consequences of the principle. They were focusing on first principles, fundamental freedoms, and they could forecast and envision what the consequences looked like of violating those principles. And so they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. They didn't wait until power had usurped itself and strengthened itself by exercise. What does he mean by that? The more government is using this, the more it strengthens its position, the status quo, right? Inertia. It's harder to repeal a law that's been used a bunch of times, because then it's like, well, look, we used it to do this good thing while not looking at all the bad things. Okay, I could go off on all kinds of tangents here. Powerful, powerful quote. The point is that this is how we fight tyranny, focusing on those fundamental freedoms, envisioning the consequence, denying the principle before allowing these things to get entangled in precedents and practice. We can't myopically focus on religious freedom while the walls of these fundamental freedoms are crumbling around us. We have to strengthen, we have to defend those outer walls, those fundamental freedoms. If we truly care about religious freedom, we have to be advocates of, like Joseph was, civil liberty as much as we are religious freedom. Otherwise, we fall into the Pastor Niemöller trap. Oh, I was just worried about my own religious liberty, but then all these things happened around me, and then there was no one left to protect me. We can't fall into that trap. Another thought is that people often surrender their freedoms incrementally. right? They're lured by promises of security or prosperity, public health, public safety, only to realize too late that the exchange was a mirage. And so, for example, when the church is trading away the freedom of employers and landlords in order to protect religious freedom narrowly, I think that sets a dangerous precedent. We have to be careful not to be lured by this mirage. Oh, yay, we'll protect religious freedom by throwing everyone else under the bus and not, going to bat for them in this broader coalition. And that, I think, can set a dangerous precedent that will come back to bite the church and undermine religious freedom because we've eroded these fundamental freedoms more broadly, whether in religious contexts or non-religious contexts. Okay, final point. Unlike secular frameworks that treat freedom as some sort of legal construct, our doctrine of agency frames it as a divine endowment, which is, intrinsic to human existence, to eternal progression, part of God's plan. So I think this elevates the fight against tyranny beyond just politics into a theological imperative, right? Any system that curtails agency, whether it's through religious suppression or economic coercion or intellectual conformity, it contradicts God's plan. So this isn't just a narrow legal exercise. This is a much broader theological issue. And so I think the church has an opportunity to position itself as a defender of this cosmic divine principle of agency, which would resonate both with, believers, but also secular advocates of freedom. If we can get out of the Niemöller trap and form these broader coalitions, focus on fundamental freedoms, whether it's, hey, you're a different religion, great, you have your religious freedom, or hey, you're using this freedom of speech to hold the government accountable or to fight, to renounce war and proclaim peace, which, by the way, is part of our religion. Like, if you're using speech in these ways that aren't narrowly construed to protect the religious institution, but are instead outgrowths of your religious imperative, the commandments from God for you as individual actors to bring to pass much righteousness on your own, being anxiously engaged in those causes, wasting and wearing out your life, breathing to light hidden things of darkness. If the church positioned itself as a defender of these broader freedoms, I think that would resonate far more broadly. It would show, just if Joseph did it, I'm just as willing to die for a Latter-day Saint as I am for all these people of other religions. That is an attractive doctrine. That is a almost magnetic position to draw people to you, because you're showing that you care about these fundamental rights outside of your own little bubble, right? I care about you. I care about these more fundamental freedoms. That, to me, is why, though I am a fan of religious freedom, I believe that it is too narrow a focus. It is too myopic. And the threat is, as Niemöller himself admitted, that if we remain focused on religious freedom as this apex of priority, it can allow us, like having tunnel vision, getting so myopic that we fail to notice the crumbling of these more fundamental freedoms all around us. And pretty soon, we don't have much of any substantive religious freedom left. We'll wrap it there. I'll see you next Sunday.